The winter of 1876 brought more than just snow to the Dakota Territory. It brought a reckoning that would test every belief a man held about duty, honor, and survival. When Thomas Brennan pulled that half-frozen girl from the drifts behind his barn, he thought he was simply saving a life. He had no way of knowing that by sunrise, 24 Lakota warriors would be standing in his yard, their faces painted for war, demanding answers he didn't have. What happened next would force him to choose between the world he knew and a truth that lived beyond the boundaries of any map. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Dakota Territory in the winter of 1876 was a place where survival wasn't guaranteed. It was earned day by brutal day through sheer will and backbreaking labor. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast white expanse broken only by the occasional stand of cottonwoods or the dark smudge of a distant homestead. Here the wind didn't just blow, it screamed across the plains with a fury that could strip the warmth from a man's bones in minutes. The cold was a living thing, patient and relentless, waiting for the smallest mistake to claim another victim, Thomas. Brennan had come to understand this land in the 3 years since he'd staked his claim along the banks of Willow Creek. His ranch wasn't much, a sturdy log cabin with a stone chimney, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, and 160 acres of grassland that turned golden in summer and disappeared entirely under snow come winter. He ran cattle, about 40 head, enough to keep him fed and give him something to sell when the railroad buyers came through in the spring. It was a solitary life, but Thomas had made peace with that. Out here, a man could think without the constant noise of other people's opinions pressing in on him. Thomas was 32 years old, though the lines around his eyes made him look older. He was tall and lean, built like a man who'd spent his life doing physical work. His hands were calloused and scarred, his face weathered by sun and wind until it had taken on the color of old leather. He kept his dark hair short and his beard trimmed close, not out of vanity, but because ice formed in a long beard, and that could be dangerous in a blizzard. His eyes were gray, the kind of gray that seemed to shift between steel and smoke, depending on his mood. And they held a wariness that came from seeing more than his share of hardship. He'd come west after the war, like so many other men who found they couldn't quite fit back into the lives they'd left behind. Thomas had served with the Union Army, surviving battles whose names still made him flinch when he heard them spoken aloud. When the fighting ended, he'd returned to his family's farm in Pennsylvania, only to find that his parents had died of fever while he was gone. His younger brother had sold the property and moved to Chicago, leaving Thomas with a small sum of money and nowhere in particular to go. The West had seemed as good a direction as any, and so he'd packed what little he owned and pointed himself toward the horizon. The ranch had given him purpose, but it hadn't given him peace. That was something Thomas was still searching for, though he wasn't sure he'd recognize it if he found it. Most days, he worked from dawn until well past dark, feeding cattle, mending fences, chopping firewood, hauling water from the creek when the pump froze. The work kept his hands busy and his mind occupied, which was exactly what he needed. When he stopped moving, the memories came back, the thunder of artillery, the screams of wounded men, the hollow look in the eyes of boys who'd aged a lifetime in a single afternoon. The nearest town was Stillwater, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a crossroads about 8 miles to the southeast. It had a general store, a blacksmith, a church, a saloon, and a population of maybe 200 souls, depending on the season. Thomas made the trip once a month to buy supplies and collect his mail, though there was rarely any mail to collect. The townspeople knew him as a quiet man, polite but not particularly friendly, the kind of neighbor who'd help you raise a barn or pull a calf, but wouldn't linger for small talk afterward. They respected his work ethic and his willingness to keep to himself, which in a place like Stillwater was considered a virtue, but respect and acceptance weren't quite the same thing. And Thomas was keenly aware of the distance that existed between himself and the other settlers. Part of it was simply his nature. He'd never been much of a talker, even before the war. But part of it was something else, something that ran deeper than personality. Thomas Brennan didn't quite fit the mold of what a Dakota Territory rancher was supposed to be. He didn't talk about manifest destiny or the civilizing mission of the white man. He didn't join in when the other men at the saloon swapped stories about Indian raids or debated the merits of various military campaigns against the tribes. He just listened, his expression carefully neutral, and changed the subject when he could. The truth was, Thomas had complicated feelings about the way things were unfolding in the territory. He'd seen enough violence in his life to know that it rarely solved anything permanently, and he'd watched enough men die for causes they barely understood to be skeptical of grand justifications for bloodshed. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, the other tribes that had lived on these plains for generations, they were fighting for their land, their way of life, their survival. Thomas could understand that. He didn't agree with all their methods, and he certainly didn't romanticize them the way some Eastern writers did. But he understood the desperation that drove people to fight when everything they knew was being taken from them. He'd felt that same desperation himself more than once. Of course, he kept these thoughts to himself. In Stillwater, expressing sympathy for the Indians was a good way to get yourself labeled a traitor or a fool. The settlers had their own fears and grievances, and many of them were legitimate. Raids did happen. People did die. Livestock was stolen, cabins were burned, families were driven from their land. The violence went both ways, and the innocent suffered on all sides. Thomas didn't pretend to have answers to problems that men far smarter than him had failed to solve. He just tried to live his life without adding to the sum total of misery in the world, and he hoped that would be enough. The winter had been particularly harsh that year. The snows had started early, in late October, and they'd kept coming with a regularity that suggested they had no intention of stopping any time soon. By December, the drifts were piled so high against the north side of the barn that Thomas could walk right up onto the roof if he wanted to. The cattle huddled together in the lee of the hills, and Thomas spent hours each day breaking ice on the creek so they could drink. His hands were perpetually cold, the kind of deep cold that settled into the joints and made every movement painful. At night, he'd sit by the fire in his cabin, thawing out slowly, knowing he'd have to do it all again in the morning. The isolation didn't bother him most days, but there were moments when the silence felt oppressive, when the walls of the cabin seemed to press in and the darkness outside stretched on forever. On those nights, Thomas would light an extra lantern and read from the small collection of books he'd brought with him. Shakespeare, Whitman, a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe that had belonged to his father. The words transported him to other places, other times, and gave him a temporary escape from the relentless monotony of winter on the plains. He'd been reading Hamlet on the night everything changed, though he wouldn't realize the significance of that until much later. The wind had been building all day, and by evening it was howling like a living creature, rattling the shutters and finding every crack in the cabin's defenses. Thomas had fed the fire until it roared, but even so, the cold crept in around the edges of the room. He sat in his chair, with a blanket over his knees, squinting at the pages by lamplight, when he heard something that didn't belong to the storm. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but unmistakable, a sound that might have been a cry or a call. Something human and desperate. Thomas set down his book and listened, his body going still. There it was again, fainter this time, almost swallowed by the shrieking of the wind. He stood up, moved to the window, and peered out into the darkness. The snow was coming down so thick he could barely see the barn, just a darker shape against the swirling white. For a moment, he considered the possibility that he'd imagined it, that his mind was playing tricks after too many hours alone. But then he heard it a third time, and he knew someone was out there. Thomas moved quickly, pulling on his heavy coat and wrapping a scarf around his face. He grabbed his rifle, not because he expected trouble, but because a man didn't go outside unarmed in the Dakota Territory. Not at night, not in winter. He lit a lantern and pushed open the door, stepping out into the full fury of the storm. The wind hit him like a physical force, nearly knocking him backward. Snow stung his exposed skin, and the cold bit through his layers of clothing almost instantly. He raised the lantern, its feeble light barely penetrating the darkness, and started toward the sound. Each step was a battle. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the wind kept changing direction, disorienting him. Thomas kept the barn to his right, using it as a landmark, and pushed forward. His lungs burned with each breath of frigid air, and ice was already forming on his scarf where his breath had dampened it. He called out, his voice barely carrying in the wind, and listened for a response. Nothing. He moved further from the cabin, his concern growing with each passing second. Anyone caught out in this storm without shelter would be dead within the hour, maybe less. Then his lantern caught something. A splash of color against the white dark fabric or hair, he couldn't tell. Thomas lunged forward, nearly losing his footing, and there she was. A girl collapsed in the snow behind his barn, her body curled into a tight ball against the cold. Her clothes were soaked through, her skin pale as death, and she wasn't moving. Thomas dropped to his knees beside her, setting the lantern down and pulling off his glove to check for a pulse. It was there, faint and irregular, but there. She was alive, but barely. He didn't hesitate. Thomas set his rifle aside and gathered the girl into his arms, lifting her as gently as he could. She was small and light, and even through his gloves he could feel how cold she was. Her body temperature dropped to a dangerous level. He tucked her against his chest, trying to shield her from the wind, and began the struggle back to the cabin. The journey that had taken him perhaps 2 minutes going out seemed to take an eternity going back. His arms ached, his legs trembled with the effort of pushing through the snow, and the wind seemed determined to knock him down. But Thomas Brennan had survived worse than a Dakota blizzard, and he wasn't about to let this girl die because he gave up. When he finally reached the cabin door, he kicked it open and stumbled inside, nearly falling. He laid the girl down on the floor in front of the fire and immediately began stripping off her wet clothing. There was no time for modesty or hesitation. Wet clothes in this cold were a death sentence. He worked quickly, removing her buckskin dress, her moccasins, the beaded jewelry around her neck. As he did, he registered details that his conscious mind was too focused to fully process in the moment. The intricate beadwork on her clothing, the style of her moccasins, the way her long black hair was braided. She was Sioux, almost certainly Lakota given the territory, and she couldn't have been more than 17 or 18 years old. Thomas wrapped her in every blanket he owned, layering them over her shivering form. He positioned her as close to the fire as he dared, then set water to heat on the stove. Hypothermia was deadly, but warming someone too quickly could be just as dangerous. He'd seen men die from it during the war. Soldiers pulled from icy rivers and put too close to campfires, their hearts unable to handle the sudden change. So he worked methodically, rubbing her hands and feet to encourage circulation, checking her breathing, talking to her even though she couldn't hear him. Hours passed. Thomas kept the fire going and gradually warmed her with heated stones wrapped in cloth, placed carefully around her body. He made her drink warm water, just small sips at first, holding her head up and coaxing the liquid past her blue lips. Slowly, painfully slowly, color began to return to her face. Her breathing grew stronger, more regular. Her body stopped its violent shivering and settled into a deep, exhausted sleep. Thomas finally allowed himself to relax, slumping back against the wall and closing his eyes for just a moment. When he opened them again, dawn was breaking outside, pale light filtering through the window. Thomas stood up, his body stiff and sore from the long night. The girl was still sleeping, her face peaceful now, the worst of the danger past. He covered her with another blanket and moved to the window, looking out at the aftermath of the storm. The wind had died down and the snow had stopped falling. Everything was white and still, beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. That's when he saw them. At first, Thomas thought his eyes were playing tricks. That exhaustion was making him see things that weren't there. But as he stared, the shapes resolved into unmistakable forms. Horses, riders, dozens of them, spread out in a wide semicircle around his property. They'd approached in silence, using the cover of the pre-dawn darkness, and now they simply waited, motionless as statues. Even from a distance, Thomas could see the paint on their faces, the weapons in their hands, the absolute stillness that spoke of trained warriors who knew exactly what they were doing. His barn was surrounded. His cabin was surrounded. And the girl, sleeping by his fire, was almost certainly the reason why. Thomas Brennan stood at his window, watching the sun rise over a landscape that had transformed overnight from his familiar ranch into something else entirely. A battlefield, a negotiation table, a place where one wrong move could mean death for everyone involved. He thought about the rifle leaning against the wall, about the girl breathing softly behind him, about the choices that had seemed so simple just 12 hours ago. Save a life, do the right thing. It had seemed straightforward at the moment now, as he watched those silent warriors and understood that they were waiting for something, for him, for an explanation, for justice or vengeance or answers he wasn't sure he could provide. Thomas realized that nothing about this situation was going to be simple. The sun continued its slow climb into the sky, and he stood there, caught between two worlds, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. The day before Thomas Brennan found her in the snow, the girl had a name, a family, and a future that seemed as certain as the sunrise. Her name was Ayasha, which meant little one in her language, though at 17 winters she'd long since outgrown the nickname. She was the youngest daughter of Chief Maka of the Hunkpapa Lakota, a man whose reputation for wisdom and fierce protection of his people had spread across 3 territories. Ayasha had grown up in a world of structure and tradition, where every season had its rhythms and every person had their place within the intricate web of tribal life. Their winter camp lay nestled in a valley 30 miles north of Thomas Brennan's ranch, protected by hills on 3 sides and watered by a spring that never froze completely even in the deepest cold. The camp consisted of 20 lodges, housing roughly 140 people, families that had chosen to winter together, pooling their resources and strengthening their bonds against the harsh months ahead. Smoke rose from the lodge tops in thin grey columns, and the smell of cooking meat and burning sage filled the air on calmer days. Children played in the snow, their laughter cutting through the winter silence, while the adults went about the endless work of survival. Ayasha's days followed patterns established long before her birth. She rose before dawn to help her mother and older sister prepare the morning meal, grinding dried corn and berries into a paste that would sustain them through the day's work. She tanned hides with a skill that had earned praise even from the oldest women in the camp, working the leather until it was soft as cloth and waterproof enough to shed rain. She beaded intricate patterns onto moccasins and clothing, her fingers swift and sure, creating designs that told stories only those who knew how to read them could understand. And she listened to the stories told by the elders, committing them to memory so that one day she could pass them on to children of her own. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But Ayasha also carried a restlessness that set her apart from the other young women in camp. While they seemed content to follow the paths laid out before them, she found herself asking questions that had no easy answers. Why did the white men keep coming when there was so much empty land already? Why couldn't the treaties be honored on both sides? Why did every solution to conflict seem to involve more bloodshed? Her father indulged these questions when they were alone, treating her curiosity with the same respect he showed his sons. But he'd also warned her that not everyone would appreciate her inquisitive nature. The trouble had started 3 days before the blizzard, though its roots went back much further than that. A group of young warriors, led by a man named Tokala, had returned from a raid on a settlement 40 miles to the east. They'd taken horses and supplies, struck quickly, and vanished before the soldiers could respond. A victory by any measure. But they'd also killed 2 settlers in the process, and one of them had been a woman. The celebration that greeted their return was muted, divided, with some of the tribe honoring their courage, while others questioned the wisdom of provoking further retaliation. Chief Maka had called a council to discuss what should be done. The warriors argued that they were defending their land, their people, their way of life, against invaders who showed no mercy themselves. The elders countered that every raid brought more soldiers, more restrictions, more pressure on the shrinking territories where they could still live freely. Ayasha had listened from outside the council lodge, as was proper for someone of her age and gender, but her heart had been torn by both arguments. She understood the anger that drove men like Tokala to strike back. She also understood that her people were vastly outnumbered, and that the railroad and the telegraph meant the whites could coordinate in ways the tribes never could. The council had ended without resolution, the divisions left to simmer beneath the surface of daily life. But Tokala wasn't finished making his position known. On the second night, he'd sought out Ayasha while she was collecting water from the spring. He was 24, a proven warrior with 3 eagle feathers in his hair and ambitions that extended beyond simple survival. He'd made it clear over the past year that he intended to court her, and her father had neither encouraged nor discouraged the possibility. Now, standing in the twilight with ice forming at the edges of the spring, Tokala had spoken to her with an intensity that bordered on desperation. "Your father listens to the old men who've forgotten what it means to be warriors," he'd said, his breath fogging in the cold air. "They talk of peace, while our lands disappear, while our hunting grounds are fenced off, while our children learn to fear the sound of wagon wheels. We need to fight, Ayasha. We need to show them that we won't simply fade away into their history books." Ayasha had set down her water vessels and met his gaze steadily. "And what happens when we fight?" she'd asked. "More of our young men die. More villages are burned. The army sends 3 soldiers for every one we kill." "I've seen the numbers, Tokala. I've heard the traders talk. There are more whites in their eastern cities than there are people in all the tribes combined. How do we win this fight?" Tokala's jaw had tightened, anger flashing in his dark eyes. "So we should just surrender. Give up everything our ancestors fought for? Let them herd us onto reservations like cattle and teach us to farm land that won't grow crops?" "I didn't say that," Ayasha replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm saying there has to be another way. Something between surrender and suicide." The conversation had ended badly, with Tokala walking away in frustration and Ayasha returning to camp with her heart heavy. She knew he wasn't entirely wrong. The situation was desperate, and desperation made people reach for solutions that might once have seemed unthinkable. But she also knew that some paths, once taken, led to places you could never return from. The next day had brought the first signs of the approaching storm. The air grew colder, sharper, with a quality that experienced plainsmen recognized as a warning. The sky took on a yellowish cast, and the wind shifted direction every few hours, as if trying to decide which way to attack from. Chief Maka ordered extra firewood cut and stored, additional food prepared, horses brought closer to camp. Everyone felt it. Something big was coming. That afternoon, Ayasha's older sister, Naira, had fallen ill. It started with a cough and rapidly progressed to fever and chills that left her shivering despite being wrapped in furs beside the lodge fire. Their mother had tried every remedy she knew, teas brewed from willow bark, poultices made from sage and other medicinal plants, prayers and songs that had healed sickness before. Nothing worked. By evening, Naira was delirious, calling out names of people long dead, her skin burning with heat that seemed to come from within. Ayasha had sat beside her sister through the night, bathing her face with cold water and holding her hand during the worst of the fever dreams. She thought of the white doctor in Stillwater, the one some of the mixed-blood families spoke of, the man who had medicines the traditional healers didn't possess. She knew her father would never agree to send someone to fetch the White Doctor. The risk was too great. The distance is too far, and the likelihood of the doctor actually coming to help an Indian girl essentially non-existent. But the thought had planted itself in her mind and refused to leave. By dawn, Naira was worse. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, and the fever showed no signs of breaking. Their mother's face had taken on the hollow look of a parent watching their child slip away, powerless to stop it. Ayesha's father sat outside the lodge, his weathered face unreadable, praying to the spirits in a voice too low to hear. And Ayesha made a decision that would alter the course of multiple lives. She would go to Stillwater herself. She would find the doctor or his medicines, steal them if necessary, and bring them back before the storm hit. It was a desperate plan, probably a foolish one, but doing nothing while her sister died felt even worse. She knew the general direction, southeast, following the frozen creek until it joined the larger river, then overland toward where the wagon roads converged. She'd made the journey once before, years ago, when her father had taken the family to trade at the fort. She could remember the route. She had to try. Ayesha waited until midday, when the adults were occupied with storm preparations and unlikely to notice one person slipping away. She dressed in her warmest clothes, took a small pouch of pemmican and dried berries, and led one of the horses, a steady mare named Wichapi, away from camp as quietly as she could manage. By the time anyone realized she was gone, she'd be too far away to catch easily, and the approaching storm would make tracking her nearly impossible. She left no note, no explanation. There wasn't time, and besides, her family would understand soon enough when she returned with what she needed to save Naira. The first few hours of the journey went smoothly. Ayesha followed the creek as planned, the mare picking her way carefully over icy ground. The temperature continued to drop, and the wind picked up, but these were expected hardships. She wrapped her blanket tighter and kept moving, her mind focused on the goal ahead. She thought about what she would say to the doctor, how she might convince him to help, or at least provide the medicines she needed. She rehearsed arguments in her head, mixing her limited English with gestures she hoped would bridge the gaps in understanding. But the storm arrived faster than even the most experienced weather readers had predicted. One moment the sky was merely grey and threatening, and the next it had opened up with a fury that seemed almost personal. Snow came down in sheets so thick that Ayesha couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The wind howled with a voice that sounded like all the angry spirits ever told of in stories, and it pushed against her with such force that the mare stumbled and nearly fell. Ayesha tried to maintain her direction, tried to keep the creek to her right, but within minutes she was completely disoriented. The mare was frightened, her eyes rolling white with panic. Ayesha dismounted, thinking it would be easier to lead the horse on foot, but this proved to be a mistake. A particularly violent gust caught them both off guard, and the mare reared, yanking the reins from Ayesha's frozen hands. She lunged for them, but the horse was already moving, disappearing into the white curtain of the blizzard before Ayesha could call out. She was alone. Panic clawed at her throat, but Ayesha forced it down. Panic killed people in situations like this. She needed to think, to move deliberately, to find shelter. She wrapped her arms around herself and started walking in what she hoped was still the right direction. But every landmark had vanished beneath the snow, and every sense of distance had been obliterated by the storm. Her world had shrunk to a white chaos that existed no more than an arm's length away. Time lost all meaning. Ayesha walked for what might have been an hour or might have been 3, each step requiring enormous effort as the snow piled deeper. Her moccasins, crafted for winter but not for this level of extreme cold and wet, had soaked through. She couldn't feel her toes anymore, which she knew was dangerous. Her face was numb beneath her scarf, and ice had formed on her eyelashes, making it difficult to keep her eyes open. She was breathing hard, her lungs burning from the frigid air, and she knew she was in serious trouble. She stumbled over something hidden beneath the snow, a fallen log or a rock she couldn't tell, and went down hard, her hands plunging into a drift. When she tried to stand, her legs wouldn't cooperate. They trembled and gave out, sending her back to her knees. Ayasha tried again, using all her strength, and managed to get upright. But she'd lost her sense of up and down, and when she took a step she immediately fell again, this time unable to rise. The cold was no longer something external, attacking from outside. It had worked its way into her core, into her bones, and she could feel it spreading through her bloodstream with each beat of her slowing heart. Ayasha knew what this meant. She'd heard the stories of people who froze to death, how it supposedly felt peaceful at the end, like falling asleep. She didn't want to sleep. She wanted to save her sister. She wanted to see her father again, to tell him she was sorry for leaving without permission, to assure him that she'd tried her best. She thought of Naira, burning with fever in the lodge. She thought of her mother's face drawn with worry. She thought of Tokala and his angry certainty that fighting was the only path forward. She thought of the white settlers in their town, living lives so different from her own that they might as well be creatures from another world entirely. She thought about all the ways those two worlds were colliding, all the people caught in between, trying to navigate a future that seemed determined to offer only impossible choices. The snow was actually comfortable now, almost warm. Ayasha curled into it, letting it cradle her body. Her eyes drifted closed despite her efforts to keep them open. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard voices. Her grandmother, perhaps, who died 3 winters ago, calling her name. Or maybe it was just the wind, which could sound like anything if you listened long enough. She felt herself drifting, the boundaries between her body and the world around her beginning to blur, and then, somehow, there was light, warm and yellow, cutting through the white. A voice, deep and urgent, speaking words she didn't understand in a language that wasn't her own. Hands lifting her, strong but careful, pulling her back from whatever edge she'd been approaching. She tried to open her eyes, to see who or what had found her, but the effort was too great. Consciousness slipped away like water through her fingers, and Ayasha fell into darkness that was deeper and more complete than any she'd known before. The last thought she had, before everything went silent, was a strange one. She hoped whoever had found her wasn't going to regret it, because, in the world she came from and the world she'd been trying to reach, kindness between strangers often came with a price that no one could anticipate. The debt created by saving a life could bind 2 people together in ways that went beyond simple gratitude, creating obligations and connections that transcended the boundaries of tribe or territory or belief. But those were concerns for the living, and for a long stretch of hours, measured only by the steady rhythm of a heart that refused to stop beating. Ayasha existed somewhere beyond such worries, suspended in the space between one world and the next, waiting to see which direction the current of fate would carry her. Thomas stood frozen at his window, his coffee cup halfway to his lips, as the full scope of his situation crystallized with the rising sun. The warriors hadn't moved. They remained positioned in their semicircle, their horses as still as monuments, their painted faces revealing nothing of their intentions. He counted 23 men, though there might have been more hidden beyond his line of sight. Each one held a weapon, rifles, bows, lances, held not in immediate threat but in unmistakable readiness. They were Lakota warriors, and they'd clearly been tracking the girl. The question was what they intended to do now that they'd found her. Behind him, Ayasha stirred for the first time since falling into her exhausted sleep. Thomas heard the rustle of blankets and turned to see her pushing herself up onto her elbows, her dark eyes blinking in confusion as she took in her surroundings. For a moment, she seemed completely disoriented, her gaze sweeping across the unfamiliar cabin, the rough-hewn furniture, the iron stove, the white man's belongings scattered throughout the single room. Then her eyes found Thomas, and he watched awareness flood back into her face, along with something that looked like fear. She spoke rapidly in Lakota, words tumbling over each other in what was clearly a question or series of questions. Thomas raised his hands slowly, palms out, in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. He pointed to himself and said his name clearly, Thomas Brennan. Then he pointed to her and raised his eyebrows questioningly, hoping she'd understand he was asking for her name. The girl studied him with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable, her eyes taking in every detail of his face as if trying to read his intentions written there. Finally, she touched her chest and said, Ayasha. Her voice was hoarse from the cold and whatever she'd been through, but steady. She pointed toward the window, toward where the warriors waited, and spoke again in Lakota, a longer sentence this time, urgent and questioning. Thomas nodded and gestured for her to come look, though he moved slowly, keeping his hands visible. Ayasha clutched the blankets around herself and stood on shaky legs. She crossed to the window, and when she saw the warriors outside, her entire body went rigid. She said something that sounded like a prayer or an oath, then turned to Thomas with wide eyes and spoke rapidly, her hands moving in gestures that seemed designed to communicate across the language barrier. He understood enough. Those men had come for her, and she was trying to tell him something important. Maybe that he was in danger, maybe asking what he intended to do, maybe explaining who they were. Thomas held up one finger in a wait gesture and moved to his small table, where he kept paper and pencil for recording cattle counts and supply needs. He sketched quickly, a simple drawing of a person lying in snow, another person carrying them, a house. He pointed to the drawing, then to Ayasha, then to himself, trying to communicate the basic facts of what had happened. Ayasha looked at the drawing, then back at Thomas. Something shifted in her expression, recognition perhaps, or understanding. She touched the drawing of the person in the snow, then touched her chest. She pointed to the drawing of the person carrying, then to Thomas. She understood. He'd found her and brought her here. Now she studied his face again, and this time what he saw there wasn't fear but calculation. She was trying to figure out what kind of man he was, what his motives might be, whether she was in a different kind of danger now. A sharp sound cut through the morning air, a voice calling out in Lakota from somewhere beyond the cabin. The words were commanding, unmistakably a demand. Thomas didn't need to speak the language to understand that someone outside wanted answers, and they wanted them now. Ayasha moved to respond, but Thomas caught her arm gently and shook his head. He needed to think this through. If he let her simply walk out there, he had no idea what would happen next. The warriors might take her and leave peacefully, grateful she was alive. Or they might assume the worst about what had happened in this cabin overnight, about why a white rancher had a Lakota girl inside his home with her clothes drying by the fire. Assumptions like that could turn this standoff deadly in seconds. He released her arm and moved to his door, taking a deep breath before opening it. The cold air hit him immediately, a sharp reminder that the blizzard might have passed, but winter was far from finished with them. Thomas stepped out onto his porch, leaving his rifle inside deliberately. He raised both hands, showing he was unarmed, and stood there waiting for whatever came next. The warrior who'd called out sat on a paint horse about 30 yards from the cabin. He was older than the others Thomas could see, maybe 50, with grey streaking through his long black hair and a bearing that spoke of authority earned through decades of leadership. He wore a heavy buffalo robe over his shoulders, and 3 eagle feathers hung from his hair. His face was weathered as old leather, marked with lines that could have been from laughter or hardship, or both. When he spoke again, his voice carried clearly across the snowy yard, the Lakota words crisp and unmistakably a question directed at Thomas. Thomas spread his hands wider, showing his helplessness with the language. "I don't speak Lakota," he called back, "but your daughter, I think she's your daughter, she's safe. She was freezing in the snow. I brought her inside." He pointed to the cabin, then made a gesture of carrying something, then pointed to his heart and made what he hoped looked like a shivering motion. The older warrior's expression didn't change, but Thomas saw his eyes narrow slightly. He spoke again, this time adding a gesture that seemed to indicate he wanted to see Ayasha, to confirm she was actually there and unharmed. Thomas turned back to the open door where Ayasha had appeared, still wrapped in blankets but standing where she could be seen. She called out to the warrior, father, Thomas assumed, in a long stream of Lakota that sounded part explanation, part reassurance. The warrior listened, his weathered face revealing nothing, though Thomas noticed his grip on his lance had loosened fractionally. Father and daughter exchanged several more sentences, their voices carrying in the cold morning air. Thomas stood between them, acutely aware that he was the focal point of this entire situation, but couldn't understand most of what was being said. He caught his own name once, Thomas Brennan, spoken by Ayesha in the middle of a longer explanation. Whatever she was telling her father, she seemed to be vouching for Thomas's actions or character or both. Finally, Chief Marker, though Thomas didn't yet know his name, spoke what was clearly a command. 4 warriors dismounted and began walking toward the cabin, their movements deliberate and non-threatening, but also unmistakably purposeful. Thomas's instinct was to retreat, to put himself between these armed men and Ayesha, but he forced himself to remain still. Any sudden movement now could be interpreted as aggression or guilt. The 4 warriors reached the porch. One of them, a younger man with fierce eyes and 3 eagle feathers in his hair, spoke directly to Thomas in heavily accented but understandable English. Chief Marker says his daughter will dress and come out. You will stay where we can see you. We will wait to hear her story in her own words. Thomas nodded. Of course. Her clothes are by the fire, almost dry. I'll wait out here. He gestured to the porch, making it clear he wasn't going anywhere. The young warrior studied him for a long moment, his expression somewhere between suspicion and grudging respect. You speak the truth about finding her in snow? I heard her cry out during the storm, Thomas said, meeting the warrior's gaze steadily. I went looking with a lantern. She was behind my barn, unconscious. I brought her in and warmed her by the fire. That's all that happened. I swear it on whatever honor you think a white man might have. Something flickered in the warrior's eyes. Maybe surprise at Thomas's directness. Maybe appreciation that he wasn't making excuses or demanding gratitude. He turned and spoke to his companions in Lakota. Then 2 of them entered the cabin, while the other 2 remained on the porch with Thomas. The wait that followed was excruciating, maybe 10 minutes that felt like an hour. Thomas kept his hands visible and his expression neutral, very aware of the armed men on either side of him and the 20 or so more warriors still mounted and watching from the yard. When Ayesha emerged, she was dressed in her own clothes, now dry, her long black hair rebraided. She looked stronger than she had earlier, though still pale and clearly exhausted. She walked past Thomas without meeting his eyes and moved toward her father, navigating the snow with careful steps. The warriors who'd been inside followed her out, and one of them was carrying Thomas's blankets folded neatly. He placed them on the porch railing without a word. Chief Marker dismounted as his daughter approached. He embraced her, and for just a moment his carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing the fear and relief of a father who'd thought his child might be lost forever. They spoke quietly, too low for Thomas to hear, even if he'd understood the language. Then Marker turned toward the cabin, toward Thomas, and called out what was clearly an order. The young warrior who'd spoken English earlier translated, Chief Marker says you will come. He will hear your words about what happened. Thomas descended from his porch and walked toward the chief, very conscious of how exposed he was, how easily this could go wrong. He stopped about 10 feet away, a respectful distance, and waited. Marker studied him with dark eyes that seemed to see right through whatever walls a man might try to build around himself. When he spoke, it was in Lakota, but he paused after each sentence to allow the younger warrior to translate. My daughter says you found her dying in the snow. She says you carried her to your lodge and kept her warm by your fire. She says you gave her water and blankets and asked nothing in return. She says you touched her only to save her life, with hands that meant no harm. The translator paused, then added in a tone that made it clear these were his own words, not the chief's. She also says you are honorable, which is not something she's said about many white men. Thomas absorbed this, choosing his next words carefully. Your daughter was in trouble. Any decent man would have done the same. I'm just glad I heard her before it was too late. The translator relayed this, and Maka responded with another question. Why did you not bring her out immediately this morning when you saw us? Why did you keep her inside? This was the dangerous part, the question where Thomas's answer could determine whether he lived or died. He took a breath and answered honestly, because I didn't know what you would think. A white man, alone in a cabin with a Lakota girl overnight. I know how that looks. I was afraid you'd assume the worst before anyone could explain. I wanted to make sure Ayasha could tell you herself what happened in her own words, so you'd know the truth. The translation of this took longer, with the young warrior and the chief exchanging several sentences before Maka finally nodded slowly. He spoke again, his tone less confrontational than before. Chief Maka says you understood our honor, and in understanding it, you showed your own. He says his daughter's life is worth more than all the horses in 3 territories. He says you have given him back what he thought was lost. The translator paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. He says you have created a debt that must be acknowledged. Thomas shook his head. No debt. I don't want payment for doing what any human being should do. This translation caused a stir among the warriors, several of them speaking at once, in what sounded like surprise or disagreement. Maka raised a hand for silence, then spoke at length, his words measured and formal. The translator's voice took on a similar formality. Chief Maka says you do not understand. Among our people, a life debt is not about payment. It is about connection, about the joining of fates. When you saved his daughter, you became part of her story, and she became part of yours. This cannot be erased or ignored. Thomas wasn't sure what to say to that. The concept was foreign to him, but he could hear the weight behind it, the seriousness with which these men regarded such obligations. Before he could formulate a response, Ayasha herself stepped forward and spoke directly to him in halting English that clearly required great effort. You save life, in my people's way. This means something. You are not an enemy now. You are... She struggled for the word, then said something in Lakota to the translator. She says you are Kola, the young warrior said. Friend, ally, someone whose well-being matters to her family and her tribe. The implications of this were staggering, and Thomas felt the weight of them settling onto his shoulders. In a territory where the line between settler and Sioux was often marked in blood, where trust between the two groups was virtually non-existent, he'd somehow ended up on the other side of that line, simply by doing what his conscience demanded. Chief Maka spoke again, and this time his words were clearly a pronouncement rather than a conversation. You will come to our winter camp when 3 suns have passed. We will hold a feast to honor what you have done and to formalize the bond between us. You will be marked as a friend of the Hunkpapa Lakota, and any who harm you will answer to me. Thomas opened his mouth to protest, to explain that he didn't need or want such recognition, that it would only complicate his life in ways these men couldn't imagine. But as he looked at Maka's face, at Ayasha's hopeful expression, at the assembled warriors who were watching this exchange with intense interest, he realized that refusing would be an insult of the highest order. They were offering him something precious, acceptance, protection, kinship, and turning it down would be rejecting not just the offer, but the people making it. I'll come, he said simply. 3 days from now, and I'm honored by the invitation. The tension that had filled the air since dawn finally began to dissipate. Warriors relaxed their grips on weapons. Horses shifted and stamped, sensing the change in atmosphere. Maka nodded once, a gesture that seemed to seal an agreement between them, then turned and walked back to his horse. Ayasha followed him, but before she mounted behind her father, she turned back to look at Thomas one more time. Their eyes met across the trampled snow, and Thomas saw something in her gaze that he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, certainly, but also curiosity, maybe even the beginning of respect. She raised one hand in a small wave, a gesture that seemed to bridge the enormous cultural divide between them, then climbed onto the horse behind her father. The warriors mounted up in a coordinated movement that spoke of long practice and discipline. Chief Maka raised his hand in what might have been a salute or a farewell, then wheeled his horse around. The entire group began to move, riding back the way they'd come, leaving tracks in the snow that would disappear with the next storm. Thomas watched them go, standing alone in his yard as the sun climbed higher and the temperature began its grudging rise above freezing. When they'd vanished beyond the hills, Thomas finally allowed himself to sit down, right there in the snow, as the full impact of what had just happened washed over him. He'd saved a girl's life. He'd somehow earned the respect of a Lakota chief. He'd been invited into a world that most settlers would never see and wouldn't want to see if given the chance. And in 3 days, he was going to have to ride into a Sioux winter camp and navigate social situations he had no training for. Operating under customs he barely understood. Part of him wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Part of him wanted to be terrified of what he'd gotten himself into. But mostly, as he sat there in the snow with the morning sun warming his face, Thomas Brennan felt something he hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember. He felt like his actions had mattered, like the universe had put him in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to do something genuinely good. Whatever complications came next, whatever prices he'd have to pay for the choice he'd made, at least he could say he'd done the right thing when it counted. He stood up, brushed the snow from his pants, and walked back toward his cabin. There was work to do, cattle to feed, fences to check, a normal day to attempt despite the morning's extraordinary events. But as he went through the motions of his routine, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about Ayasha's face when she'd called him Kola, couldn't stop, replaying the chief's words about debts and connections and the joining of fates. He'd lived alone for so long, keeping the world at arm's length, that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to matter to someone beyond himself. Now somehow, his life had become entangled with people he'd never expected to know, in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. The loneliness that had been his constant companion since the war felt less oppressive than it had yesterday, replaced by something that might have been anticipation, or might have been dread, or might have been both at once. 3 days. In 3 days, everything would change again. Thomas had learned enough about life to know that moments like these, moments when the path forward suddenly diverged from everything you'd expected, were the ones that defined who you became. He could refuse the invitation, stay on his ranch, keep his distance from complications and entanglements. Or he could ride into that Lakota camp and see where this strange new connection might lead. As he fed his cattle and went about his chores, Thomas already knew which choice he'd make. He'd saved Ayasha because it was the right thing to do, and now he'd honor the bond that act had created because that, too, was right. Whatever came after, he'd face it the same way he'd faced everything else in his complicated life, with his eyes open and his conscience clear, and a willingness to let the consequences fall where they may. The 2 days between the warrior's departure and the feast passed in a strange blur for Thomas. He went through his usual routines, tending cattle, repairing tack, chopping wood, but his mind was elsewhere, turning over the implications of what had happened. He'd crossed an invisible line that most settlers spent their entire lives trying to avoid, and he knew that once word got out, his life in Stillwater would never be the same. The question wasn't whether people would find out, but when and how, and what they'd do with the information once they had it. The answer came sooner than he expected. On the afternoon of the second day, Thomas spotted a rider approaching from the direction of town. As the figure drew closer, he recognized Samuel Thornton, who owned the farm 3 miles south. Samuel was a decent man, quiet and hard-working, someone Thomas had helped with a barn raising the previous summer. They weren't exactly friends, but they existed on good terms, the kind of neighborly relationship that defined life on the frontier, where people depended on each other for survival. Samuel dismounted near the cabin, and Thomas could see immediately that something was wrong. The man's face was tight with worry, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to be followed. Thomas offered coffee, and they sat on the porch despite the cold, both men holding their cups and saying nothing for a long moment. Finally, Samuel spoke. Word's gotten around about what happened here 2 mornings ago. About the Sioux girl and the warriors surrounding your place. Thomas had been expecting this, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. How'd you hear about it? Henry Caldwell was checking his trapline up in the hills. Saw the whole thing from a distance. The warriors, the girl coming out of your cabin, you talking with the chief. He rode straight to town and told everyone who'd listen. Samuel paused, his weathered hands wrapped around the coffee cup. Thomas, people are talking. And not in a good way. What are they saying? Samuel looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight on the porch steps. Some folks think you're a traitor. Others think you've lost your mind. Pastor Williams is calling you a sinner for having an unmarried woman in your home, Indian or not. And there's a group forming up, men who think you've made some kind of deal with the Sioux, that you're helping them scout settlements or some such nonsense. Thomas felt anger rising in his chest, hot and bitter. I saved a girl's life. That's all. She was dying in the snow, and I brought her inside to warm her by the fire. What was I supposed to do, let her freeze? I believe you, Samuel said quickly. I know you're a good man, Thomas, but you know how people get. They're scared. There's been raids, attacks, friends and family killed. Some folks see any Indian as the enemy, and anyone who helps them as an enemy too. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. There's talk of a town meeting tomorrow night. They want you to come and explain yourself, answer questions about what happened and what your intentions are. And if I don't come... Samuel's expression grew darker. Then they'll come here. And I don't think that conversation will go as well as one in the church hall with witnesses and some semblance of law and order. Thomas set down his coffee cup, his jaw tight. He'd known there would be consequences, but he'd hoped for more time, more space to navigate this situation carefully. I'll come to the meeting, but I'm not going to apologize for doing the right thing. Nobody's asking you to apologize, Samuel said, though his tone suggested that actually quite a few people were asking for exactly that. Just explain what happened. Be honest. Maybe it'll settle people down. He stood up, preparing to leave. For what it's worth, Thomas, I'd have done the same thing you did. Life's life, no matter who it belongs to. After Samuel rode away, Thomas stood on his porch and watched the sun sink toward the western horizon. The town meeting was tomorrow night. The feast at the Lakota camp was the night after that. He was caught between 2 worlds, and neither one seemed particularly interested in understanding the other's perspective. All he'd done was save a life, but somehow that simple act had become complicated by politics and prejudice and fear. The next evening, Thomas rode into Stillwater as darkness fell. The temperature had dropped again, and his breath formed white clouds in the frigid air. The town looked the same as always. Wooden buildings with snow piled on their roofs, smoke rising from chimneys, the warm glow of lantern light in the windows. But Thomas felt the difference immediately. People on the street stopped talking when they saw him. A woman pulled her children closer. 2 men standing outside the saloon stared at him with open hostility. The church hall was packed, every bench filled and people standing along the walls. Thomas recognized most of the faces. These were his neighbors, people he'd traded with and worked alongside. Now they looked at him like he was a stranger, or worse, like he was something dangerous that had infiltrated their community. Pastor Williams stood at the front, his thin frame draped in black, his gaunt face set in lines of stern disapproval. Beside him sat Mayor Dixon, a heavy-set man with a politician's smile and a businessman's calculating eyes. Thomas walked down the center aisle, feeling every eye on him, and stood before the assembly. The room went quiet, the kind of silence that pressed down on you like a physical weight. Mayor Dixon spoke first, his voice carrying the practiced tone of someone used to public speaking. Thomas Brennan, you've been called here tonight to address certain concerns that have arisen regarding your conduct 2 days past. Specifically, reports that you harbored a Sioux woman in your home overnight and subsequently engaged in what appeared to be friendly discourse with a band of Sioux warriors. Is this accurate? Thomas met the mayor's eyes steadily. Yes, that's what happened. A murmur ran through the crowd, even though everyone there already knew the basic facts. Hearing Thomas confirm it seemed to make it more real, more damning. And what was the nature of your relationship with this Indian woman? This question came from Pastor Williams, his voice sharp with judgment. I didn't have a relationship with her, Thomas said, keeping his voice level. I found her dying in the snow during the blizzard. I brought her inside, warmed her by the fire, and made sure she didn't freeze to death. When the storm passed and her people came looking for her, I let them take her home. That's the entire story. You expect us to believe, Pastor Williams said, his voice rising, that you spent an entire night alone with a young woman and nothing improper occurred, that you didn't take advantage of her vulnerable state? Thomas felt his hands curl into fists, and he forced them to relax. Yes, that's exactly what I expect you to believe, because it's the truth. She was unconscious or delirious for most of the night. I was trying to keep her alive, not... He stopped himself before saying something he'd regret. I did what any Christian man should do when he finds another human being in mortal danger. I helped. A man stood up in the third row, Marcus Hendricks, whose brother had been killed in a Sioux raid 2 years ago. And what about those warriors? What did you talk about with them? What deals did you make? No deals, Thomas said firmly. The chief thanked me for saving his daughter's life. That's all. That's not what Henry Caldwell says, another voice called out. He says they marked you as one of their own, says they're treating you like you're part of their tribe now. Thomas took a breath. This was the moment he'd been dreading. The chief invited me to a feast to honor what I did. In their culture, saving someone's life creates a bond. They want to acknowledge that bond formally. The room erupted. People shouted over each other, some in anger, some in fear, all of them convinced that Thomas had somehow betrayed them. Mayor Dixon banged his gavel, calling for order, but it took several minutes before the crowd settled down enough for him to be heard. You're planning to go to this feast? The mayor asked. His expression troubled. I am. Then you're a traitor, someone shouted from the back. You're consorting with the enemy, another voice added. Pastor Williams raised his hands for silence. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of religious authority. Thomas Brennan, you stand before this community accused of conduct unbecoming of a Christian man. You've brought shame upon yourself and potentially put all of us in danger by forming an alliance with savages who've killed our people. Thomas felt something snap inside him. Savages? That girl would have died if I'd thought like you do. She has a name, Ayasha. She has a father who loves her, a family that was desperate to find her. She's a human being, Pastor, same as any girl in this room. And if helping her makes me a traitor in your eyes, then I guess that's what I am. The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas had just said what no one in Stillwater dared to say, had given voice to a sympathy for the Indians that most settlers considered tantamount to treason. He could see the shock on their faces, the way they pulled back from him, as if his words were contagious. Sarah Morrison, the schoolteacher, stood up. She was a young woman, maybe 25, with intelligent eyes and a reputation for fairness. I think we're missing the point here. Mr. Brennan saved a life. Isn't that what we're supposed to do? What does the Bible teach us to do? The Bible also teaches us about righteousness and the company we keep. Pastor William shot back. These people are heathens, Miss Morrison. They worship false gods and practice barbaric customs. We cannot condone... The Bible teaches us that everyone is made in God's image, Sarah interrupted, her voice firm, including Indians. If Mr. Brennan had let that girl die when he could have saved her, wouldn't that be a sin? This sparked a new round of arguments, with some people supporting Sarah's position and others vehemently opposing it. Thomas stood silently, watching his neighbors tear themselves apart over a question that had seemed so simple when he was standing in a blizzard with a dying girl in his arms. Mayor Dixon banged his gavel again. Enough, this isn't getting us anywhere. He turned to Thomas. Here's the situation as I see it. You did what you thought was right, and maybe it was. But you've also created a problem for this community. If you attend that feast, if you accept whatever bond or alliance they're offering, you're going to be seen as someone who's chosen sides. And it's not our side. I'm not choosing sides, Thomas said. I'm trying to be a decent human being. In this territory, there is no in-between, Hendrik said, still standing. You're either with us or against us. And if you go to that Sioux camp, you're making your choice clear. Thomas looked around the room, at the faces of people he'd known for 3 years. He saw fear there, and anger, and the kind of rigid thinking that came from living in constant danger. He understood it, even felt sympathy for it. But he also saw something else, a willingness to let a girl die because of her race, a readiness to condemn him for showing basic humanity, a refusal to see the Indians as anything other than enemies, to be destroyed or driven away. Then I guess I've made my choice, Thomas said quietly. Because I'm going to that feast. The room erupted again, but this time Mayor Dixon didn't try to restore order. He simply sat back in his chair, his expression resigned, as if he'd expected this outcome but hoped for better. Pastor Williams stood and pointed at Thomas, his voice rising above the chaos. Then you are no longer welcome in this church, Thomas Brennan. You have chosen the path of the sinner and the traitor, and until you repent, I'll save you the trouble, Pastor. Thomas cut him off. I haven't been to your church in over a year anyway. And if Christianity means letting people die because they're different from us, then maybe I don't want to be part of it. He turned and walked out, leaving the chaos behind him. The cold night air hit him like a slap, but it felt cleaner somehow than the atmosphere inside that hall. Thomas untied his horse and mounted up, very aware that some of the men from the meeting were following him out, standing on the church steps and watching him with hostile eyes. Samuel Thornton caught up with him before he could ride away. Thomas, wait. You don't have to do this. Just apologize. Tell them you've changed your mind about the feast, and this can all blow over. Thomas looked at his neighbor, this decent man who was trying to help, and shook his head. Yes, I do have to do this. Because if I don't, what kind of man am I? I'd be saying that their lives don't matter, that fear and prejudice are more important than doing what's right. I can't live with that, Samuel. Then you won't be able to live here, Samuel said sadly. You understand that, don't you? After this, after you go to that feast, most folks in Stillwater won't trade with you, won't speak to you. You'll be shut out, I know. Thomas gathered his reins. But I'll still be able to look at myself in the mirror. That's worth something. He rode out of town slowly, deliberately, refusing to hurry as if he were fleeing. Behind him, he could hear voices raised in argument, could feel the weight of their stares. His life in Stillwater was effectively over. He understood that now. The town meeting hadn't been about getting his side of the story. It had been about forcing him to choose between their approval and his conscience. They'd expected him to back down, to prioritize his place in their community over a girl he'd never see again, but they'd miscalculated. Thomas Brennan had seen too much death in his life to be casual about letting someone die when he could prevent it. He'd fought in a war that was supposed to be about freedom and justice, had watched men give their lives for principles that were supposed to matter. And then he'd come west to find peace, only to discover that the same ugly divisions that had torn the nation apart were alive and well on the frontier, just dressed up in different language. The ride back to his ranch felt longer than usual, the darkness deeper. Thomas thought about what came next. He'd be an outcast in Stillwater, which meant getting supplies would be difficult. Trading his cattle would be a challenge. His life would become harder in 100 small ways. But the alternative, apologizing for saving Ayasha's life, turning his back on the connection he'd formed with her people, that was impossible. Some prices were too high to pay, even for an easier life. When he reached his cabin, Thomas took care of his horse and went inside. The fire had died down to embers, and the room was cold. He built up the flames and sat down in his chair, staring into the dancing light. Tomorrow night, he'd ride to the Lakota camp. He'd attend their feast, accept their friendship. And whatever came after that, he'd deal with it. For the first time since the war, Thomas Brennan felt like he was fighting for something that actually mattered. Not territory or politics or competing visions of how the frontier should be settled, but something simpler and more fundamental. the idea that every life had value. That kindness wasn't conditional on shared blood or belief. That being human meant recognizing humanity in others, even when it was difficult or dangerous to do so. The town had wanted him to choose a side, and he had. But it wasn't the side they'd meant. It wasn't white against Indian, settler against native. It was the side of conscience against convenience, principle against prejudice. And having made that choice, Thomas found that he could sleep that night despite everything, his dreams untroubled by regret. The next evening, as the sun set on his third day since the rescue, Thomas prepared for the journey to the Lakota winter camp. He dressed in his warmest clothes, packed some small gifts, tobacco, sugar, coffee, things he hoped would be appropriate to bring to a feast. He checked his rifle and his pistol, not because he expected trouble, but because a man traveling alone in winter didn't take chances. And then, as the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear, he mounted his horse and rode north into a future he couldn't predict, toward people he barely knew, carrying nothing but his word and his willingness to honor a bond he hadn't sought but wouldn't refuse. Behind him, Stillwater settled into its evening routines, the people there secure in their certainties and their judgments. Ahead of him, a Lakota camp waited, prepared to welcome a white man into their midst in a ceremony that would bind their fates together in ways that none of them could fully foresee. And between these two worlds, Thomas Brennan rode alone, a bridge neither side had asked for, but both would need before the winter was through. The journey to the Lakota winter camp took Thomas nearly 3 hours. Following landmarks Ayasha's father had described through the translator, a distinctive rock formation that looked like a bear's head, a frozen creek that bent sharply east, a stand of dead cottonwoods struck by lightning years ago. The moon was nearly full, casting blue-white light across the snow and making navigation easier than he'd expected. Still, Thomas felt his anxiety growing with each mile. He was riding into a world he knew almost nothing about, operating under customs and expectations he barely understood. When he crested the final hill and looked down into the valley, Thomas had to pause. The winter camp spread out below him was unlike anything he'd imagined. 20 lodges formed a rough circle around a central open space, each one glowing from within like a lantern, smoke rising from the peaks into the night sky. Horses were corralled in a protected area to the south, and Thomas could see figures moving between the lodges, going about their evening activities. It looked peaceful, organized, and most strikingly, it looked like home for the people who lived there, as much as any settler town he'd ever seen. 2 riders appeared from the shadows before Thomas could descend into the valley. He recognized one of them, the young warrior who'd translated for Chief Maka. The other was an older man, weathered and silent, who simply watched Thomas with dark, unreadable eyes. "You came," the translator said, and Thomas couldn't tell if there was surprise in his voice or approval or neither. "The chief said you would, but others doubted. They said no white man would honor such an invitation." "I gave my word," Thomas said simply. "Where I come from, that means something." The translator studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'm called Chaska. It means firstborn son. The chief has asked me to be your voice in camp, to help you understand our ways." He gestured to his companion. "This is Hanska. He will watch you, to make sure you mean no harm to our people." Thomas understood. He was a guest, but also a potential threat. They'd take no chances with the safety of their families. "That's fair. I'd do the same if the situation were reversed." Something flickered in Chaska's eyes, maybe respect, maybe just acknowledgement that Thomas understood the reality of his position. "Come. The feast is prepared, and it is disrespectful to make the chief wait." They rode down into the valley together, with Hanska taking up a position behind Thomas in a way that was protective and watchful at the same time. As they entered the camp, Thomas became acutely aware of the attention focused on him. People emerged from their lodges to watch him pass, women with children clinging to their skirts, old men smoking pipes, young warriors with suspicious eyes. No one called out or made threatening gestures, but Thomas could feel the weight of their scrutiny, their uncertainty about what his presence meant. Chaska led him to the largest lodge, positioned at what seemed to be the center of the camp. "This is Chief Maka's lodge. You will leave your weapons with Hanska before entering." "This is custom." Thomas had expected this. He dismounted and carefully unbuckled his gun belt, then drew his rifle from its scabbard. He handed both to Hanska, who accepted them with a slight nod. Being unarmed in a camp full of warriors who had every reason to distrust whites made Thomas's skin crawl, but he forced himself to breathe normally. Trust had to start somewhere. "One more thing," Chaska said. "When you enter, move to your left and wait. Do not speak until the chief acknowledges you. Do not sit until offered a place." And he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Do not show surprise or distaste at anything you see or are offered. Among my people, a man's face should show respect, not judgment." Thomas nodded, committing these rules to memory. Then Chaska lifted the lodge flap and gestured for him to enter. The interior of the lodge was warmer than Thomas expected, heated by a fire burning in the center. The smoke rose through an opening in the peak, and the interior was lit with a golden glow that made everything seem softer, more intimate. Chief Maka sat at the back of the lodge, positioned in the place of honor. Ayasha sat to his right, dressed in a beautiful buckskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork and porcupine quills. To the chief's left sat an older woman who Thomas assumed was his wife, and beyond her several other people Thomas didn't recognize, family members probably, or tribal elders important enough to be included in this ceremony. Thomas moved to his left as instructed and stood quietly, his hands at his sides waiting. Chief Maka watched him with those same penetrating eyes that seemed to read everything a man tried to hide. The silence stretched out, not uncomfortable exactly, but heavy with significance. This was a test, Thomas realized, to see if he could follow instructions, if he could show patience and respect even when uncertain. Finally, Maka spoke in Lakota. Chaska, who'd entered behind Thomas, translated, "The chief welcomes you to his lodge. He says you honor us by coming, and we will honor you in return." Maka gestured to a place near the fire, opposite where Ayasha sat. "Please sit. Share our food and our fire." Thomas sat cross-legged, as he'd seen the others do, though his knees protested the position immediately. Years of frontier work had left him stiff in ways he usually didn't notice. Around the fire, the other members of the gathering watched him with varying degrees of interest and wariness. Maka spoke again, and Chaska translated, "Before we eat, there are words that must be said. Among the Lakota, when a man saves a life, he becomes responsible for that life in a sacred way. You saved my daughter from death, and now there is a bond between your spirit and hers. This bond extends to her family, to her tribe. We cannot ignore this connection, nor would we want to." Thomas listened carefully, sensing that something important was being established here, something that went beyond simple gratitude. In recognition of this bond, Maka continued through Chaska, "I declare before these witnesses that you, Thomas Brennan, a Kola to my family, friend, ally, one whose fate is joined with ours. While you wear this mark, any Lakota who harms you will answer to me. And should you need aid, you may call upon us, as we may call upon you." A woman Thomas hadn't noticed before stepped forward from the shadows. She was ancient, her face deeply lined, her white hair braided with feathers and beads. She carried a small clay bowl filled with what looked like ash or paint. She dipped her fingers into the mixture and approached Thomas, speaking in Lakota too rapid for him to catch even a single word. "She is asking permission to mark you," Chaska explained. "This is the sign of a Kolaship. You may refuse, but it would be a grave insult." Thomas met the old woman's eyes and nodded. "I'm honored." She smiled then, revealing gaps where teeth had once been, and her weathered face transformed into something almost mischievous. She touched his forehead with her painted fingers, drawing a symbol he couldn't see but could feel. 3 lines, maybe, or a circle. She spoke again, her voice stronger now, almost commanding. "She says the mark will fade from your skin," Chaska translated, "but not from your spirit. She says you have a good heart, even if you are ignorant of many things." There was a ripple of quiet laughter around the fire at this, and Thomas found himself smiling despite his nervousness. The ceremony was complete. Food was brought out: roasted venison, a thick stew made with corn and squash, some kind of bread that tasted vaguely sweet, dried berries mixed with fat that was surprisingly good. Thomas ate when the others ate, following their lead, trying not to do anything that would mark him as foolish or disrespectful. The meal was accompanied by conversation in Lakota that flowed around him like a river around a stone. Occasionally, Chaska would translate a comment or question directed at him, and Thomas would answer as honestly as he could. Ayasha spoke for the first time since he'd entered the lodge, her voice clear and directed at her father. Whatever she said caused Maka to nod thoughtfully, then look at Thomas with renewed interest. "My daughter says you should know why she was out in the storm," Chaska translated. "She wants you to understand that she was not running away or doing something foolish for no reason." Ayasha spoke again, longer this time, her hands moving to emphasize certain points. As Chaska translated, Thomas learned about Naira's illness, about Ayasha's desperate plan to reach the doctor in Stillwater, about how the storm had overtaken her faster than she'd anticipated. "She asks if her sister would have been helped by your doctor," Chaska finished. "If the medicine of the whites could have saved her." Thomas considered the question carefully. "Don't know, maybe. Our doctors have medicines for fevers, but not all fevers can be cured. Did your sister survive?" Ayasha nodded, speaking again. "The fever broke the morning after the storm," Chaska translated. "The old grandmother," he gestured to the woman who'd marked Thomas. "She sang healing songs and made tea from special roots. Naira is weak, but she lives." Relief flooded through Thomas, though he wasn't entirely sure why it mattered so much to him. "I'm glad." "I'm very glad." The conversation shifted then, with the elders asking Thomas questions about his life, where he came from, why he'd come west, whether he had family. Thomas answered honestly, explaining about the war, about losing his parents, about seeking a new start in a place where the past didn't follow quite so closely. He found himself telling them things he rarely spoke of, perhaps because Chaska's translations gave him a buffer, a slight distance that made honesty easier. One of the elders, a man with grey braids and a face like carved stone, asked a question that Chaska seemed reluctant to translate. Finally he said, "Wakinyan wants to know why you don't hate us. He says most white men who come to our land see us as enemies or obstacles. He wants to know what makes you different." Thomas thought about this while everyone waited. It was a fair question, maybe the most important question they could ask. "I fought in a war," he said finally. "I saw what happens when people decide that other people aren't really people, when they convince themselves that killing is justified because the enemy is less than human. I saw boys who were good men do terrible things because they'd been taught to see their enemies as monsters instead of as someone's son or brother or father." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I don't hate you because I've seen too much hate, and I know where it leads. My life is hard enough without adding that burden to it." The translation of this seemed to take longer than his actual words, with Chaska and the elder exchanging several sentences. When it was done, Wakinyan looked at Thomas for a long moment, then nodded once and said something brief. "He says you speak wisdom unusual for one so young," Chaska translated. "He says perhaps there is hope for understanding between our peoples if more men thought as you do." The feast continued late into the night. Thomas learned some Lakota words, the names of foods, basic greetings, how to say thank you and friend. He heard stories about the tribe's history, about great hunts and brave warriors, about times of plenty and times of hardship. And slowly, gradually, he felt the tension in the lodge ease. He was still clearly an outsider, still viewed with some suspicion. But he was no longer quite as foreign as he'd been when he entered. When the evening finally began to wind down, Chief Maka spoke again, his tone formal. Through Chaska, he said, "You have honored us with your presence, Thomas Brennan. Now you must understand what your promise of friendship means. The bond of Kola is not a small thing. It means we will help you when you have need, and you will help us. It means our enemies become your enemies, and yours become ours. This is not a path without danger, especially for a white man who chooses to walk it. Thomas felt the weight of these words, the seriousness of what he'd accepted. I understand. Or at least I'm beginning to understand. There is more you should know, Maka continued. Your people in the town, they will not accept this friendship. They will see it as betrayal. You may lose much by choosing this path. I've already lost it, Thomas admitted. I went to a town meeting before coming here. They made it clear that by coming to this feast, I'm no longer welcome among them. This was translated, and Thomas saw surprise on several faces, followed by what looked like respect. Iyasha spoke up, her voice sharp with what sounded like anger. Chaska translated, She says your people are fools to cast you out for showing kindness. She says they deserve the loneliness they create. Before Thomas could respond, Maka raised his hand for silence. He spoke at length, his voice grave, and Chaska's translation came in careful pieces. The chief says that both our peoples are trapped in a cycle of fear and violence. He says that men like you, who can see beyond the hatred, are rare and valuable. He worries that you will be caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. That may be, Thomas said. But I'd rather be caught between two worlds trying to do right than comfortable in one world doing wrong. The lodge fell silent after Chaska translated this. Then unexpectedly, Chief Maka smiled. Not a large smile, but genuine. He spoke a single sentence. The chief says you are indeed Kola, Chaska said. A true friend speaks truth even when it is difficult. As the gathering broke up and people began to leave the lodge, Ayasha approached Thomas. She spoke in careful, halting English. Thank you for saving life, for coming tonight, for being different than other white men. Thomas looked at this young woman who'd inadvertently changed his entire life. Thank you for trusting me, both when you were dying and now. She smiled slightly, then said something in Lakota. Chaska, passing by, translated without being asked. She says you are welcome in this camp any time. She says her family's lodge is your lodge. After the formalities were complete, Chaska led Thomas to a smaller lodge that had been prepared for him. You'll stay tonight, he said. It's too late and too cold to ride back. Tomorrow, after you've rested, we'll talk more about what this friendship means in practical terms. Thomas was grateful for the shelter. Inside the lodge, buffalo robes had been laid out for sleeping, and a small fire provided warmth. As he settled in, trying to find a comfortable position on the unfamiliar bedding, Thomas reflected on the evening's events. He'd been marked as a friend by people his own community considered enemies. He'd been honored by those he'd been taught to fear, and somehow, sitting in a Lakota lodge under blankets made from buffalo hide, Thomas felt more at home than he had in months. The next morning, Thomas woke to voices outside his lodge and the smell of cooking meat. He emerged to find the camp fully awake and active despite the early hour. Children ran between the lodges, playing games in the snow. Women tended fires and worked on various tasks, scraping hides, sewing, preparing food. Men checked weapons and talked in groups, their breath fogging in the cold air. It was, Thomas realized, not so different from any frontier community he'd known. Just organized differently and following different customs. Chaska found him and brought him to share breakfast with his own family. Thomas met Chaska's wife, a quiet woman named Winona, and their two young sons who stared at Thomas with open curiosity. Over a meal of leftover venison and a kind of porridge made from corn, Chaska explained more about what Thomas's new status meant. As Kola to the chief's family, you have responsibilities, he said. If they call for help, you must come. If their enemies threaten them, you must stand with them. But also, if you call for help, they will come. If your enemies threaten you, they will stand with you. My enemies are mostly the winter and my own stubbornness, Thomas said wryly. Chaska smiled. That may change. The world is not a peaceful place, and friendships like this one can create new enemies as easily as they create new friends. Before Thomas could respond, a commotion arose from the edge of camp. Raised voices, urgent and alarmed, drew everyone's attention. Thomas and Chaska hurried toward the disturbance, along with dozens of others. 3 riders had arrived, their horses lathered with sweat despite the cold. They were speaking rapidly to Chief Maka, who'd emerged from his lodge with a stern expression. Even without understanding the language, Thomas could tell the news wasn't good. "What's happening?" he asked Chaska. The translator's face had gone grim. "Soldiers, a patrol from Fort Harrison heading this way. They're 2 days out, maybe less." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "Why? This camp hasn't done anything. You're just trying to survive the winter." "We exist," Chaska said bitterly. "For some soldiers, that's reason enough. There are treaties that say we can winter here, but not all whites respect their own treaties." Chief Maka was giving orders now, his voice calm but authoritative. People began moving with purpose, some of them heading to the horse corral, others gathering weapons or supplies. Ayasha appeared at her father's side, speaking urgently. Maka shook his head at whatever she was suggesting, but she persisted. Finally, he looked at Thomas, seeming to calculate something, then nodded to his daughter. She hurried over to Thomas, with Chaska translating her rapid words. "The soldiers will make trouble if they find a reason. My father wants to move some of our hunters to a different location, spread out so we don't look like we're preparing for war. But we need someone to go to the fort, to speak to the commander, to explain that we're peaceful and have the right to be here. And you want me to do it," Thomas said, understanding immediately. A white man vouching for the camp would carry more weight than any Lakota voice. "You are Kola," Ayasha said in English. "You promised to stand with us." Thomas looked around at the camp, at the children who'd been playing so happily moments ago, at the families just trying to survive a brutal winter, at people who'd welcomed him despite every reason to mistrust. Then he looked at Ayasha, at the hope and fear mingled in her expression. "I'll go," he said. "I'll talk to the commander. I can't promise it'll help, but I'll try." Relief flooded Ayasha's face. She spoke quickly to her father, who regarded Thomas, with an expression that might have been gratitude, or might have been respect, or might have been both. Through Chaska, he said, "You prove the bond is real. May the spirits guide your words and keep you safe." Within an hour, Thomas was mounted and ready to ride, with 2 Lakota warriors, Chaska and a stern-faced man named Takoda, accompanying him partway. As they left the valley, Thomas glanced back at the winter camp. Smoke still rose from the lodges, but he could see people moving with new urgency, preparing for whatever might come. He'd come to the camp as a guest at a feast, seeking to honor a simple promise of friendship. Now he was riding toward a military fort, to argue for the lives of people he barely knew, putting himself between 2 forces that seemed destined to collide. The awkward beginning of his friendship with the Lakota had just become something far more complicated and dangerous. But as his horse carried him south through the snow, Thomas found he didn't regret his choice. He'd told the town council he wanted to be able to look at himself in the mirror. Now he'd see if he could back up those words with action, if the bond of Kola meant anything more than ceremony and good intentions. The answer would come soon enough, when he stood before a military commander and tried to prevent a conflict that seemed as inevitable as the changing seasons. The ride to Fort Harrison took Thomas most of the day. Chaska and Takoda had accompanied him for the first few miles, until they reached the boundary of what they considered safe territory for Lakota warriors to travel. Before they parted ways, Chaska had gripped Thomas's arm with surprising strength. "Be careful what you say," he'd warned. "Army men hear what they want to hear. If you defend us too strongly, they'll think you've been corrupted or coerced. If you don't defend us enough, we'll still face their guns. You must walk a careful line." Now, as the wooden palisade walls of Fort Harrison came into view against the grey winter sky, Thomas understood the weight of that warning. He was about to try to convince military men trained to see the Lakota as hostiles, that a peaceful winter camp posed no threat. And he'd have to do it without sounding like a traitor to his own people or minimizing legitimate concerns about frontier violence. The sentries at the gate stopped him immediately, rifles raised. Thomas kept his hands visible and identified himself, explaining that he needed to speak with the fort's commander on an urgent matter. After a tense exchange and a wait while one sentry fetched an officer, Thomas was escorted inside. Fort Harrison was larger than he'd expected, with barracks, a stable, storage buildings, and a headquarters all arranged around a central parade ground. Soldiers moved about their duties with the practiced efficiency of men who'd been doing the same tasks for months. Many of them were young, boys really, no more than 18 or 19, sent west to fight in conflicts they probably didn't fully understand. Thomas was led to the headquarters building, a sturdy log structure with a stone chimney pumping smoke into the cold air. Inside, he was ushered into an office where a man in a major's uniform sat behind a desk covered in maps and papers. The major was perhaps 45, with iron-grey hair, a meticulously trimmed mustache, and the kind of rigid posture that came from decades of military discipline. "Major Edmund Garrett," the officer said, not rising or offering his hand. "My men tell me you have urgent business. State it." Thomas remained standing, since he hadn't been invited to sit. "Sir, I'm Thomas Brennan. I have a ranch about 15 miles southeast of here. I've come to speak with you about a Lakota winter camp in the valley north of my property." Garrett's eyes sharpened with interest. "You're reporting hostile activity?" "No, sir. I'm reporting a peaceful activity. The camp is Chief Marca's people, about 140 souls, mostly families. They're wintering in a valley that's within the territory allowed by the Treaty of Fort Laramie. I understand you have a patrol heading in that direction, and I wanted to provide information that might prevent an unnecessary confrontation." The major's expression hardened. "Mr. Brennan, I appreciate your civic duty in coming here, but perhaps you're not aware of the bigger picture. There have been raids throughout this territory, livestock stolen, settlements attacked. My orders are to maintain security, and that means monitoring any Indian encampments, peaceful or otherwise. I understand that, Major, but this particular camp hasn't been involved in any raids. They're just trying to survive the winter." Garrett stood up, moving to a map pinned to the wall behind his desk. "And how do you know what this camp has or hasn't been involved in? Are you in regular contact with these Indians?" Thomas heard the trap in the question, but decided honesty was his best option. "I saved Chief Marca's daughter from freezing to death in the recent blizzard. In gratitude, he's extended friendship to me. I've visited their camp, and I've seen nothing there but families trying to make it through to spring." The major turned to face him fully, his eyes cold. "So you've been consorting with the enemy. You've been welcomed into their camp, and now you come here, speaking on their behalf." He shook his head slowly. "Mr. Brennan, do you understand how this looks?" "It looks like I'm trying to prevent bloodshed that doesn't need to happen," Thomas said, keeping his voice level. "Sir, I fought in the war. I served 3 years with the Union Army. I understand following orders and maintaining discipline, but I also understand the difference between legitimate threats and families just trying to survive." "The war," Garrett said, moving back to his desk. "What unit?" 16th Pennsylvania Infantry. Saw action at Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. Something shifted in Garrett's expression, not quite respect, but at least acknowledgement that Thomas had credentials. "You saw the elephant, then?" "Real fighting." He sat down, gesturing for Thomas to take a chair across from him. "That makes your current position even more puzzling. You know what happens when you underestimate an enemy." Thomas sat, choosing his words carefully. "I also know what happens when you create enemies where none existed before. Major, I'm not naive about the situation out here. I know there have been raids and violence, but if your patrol rides into that camp with guns ready, treating peaceful families like hostiles, you'll create enemies who might have been allies. Or at least, you'll give ammunition to the warriors who argue that fighting is the only option. Garrett steepled his fingers, studying Thomas. What exactly are you proposing? Let me ride with your patrol. Let me help facilitate communication between your men and the chief. If you see anything that suggests hostile intent, you can act accordingly. But if it's what I say it is, just families trying to winter, then you can report back that you've confirmed a peaceful camp and move on. And what do you get out of this arrangement, Mr. Brennan? What's your interest in protecting these Indians? Thomas met the Major's gaze steadily. A clear conscience, and maybe, just maybe, the chance to prove that we don't have to solve every problem in this territory with bullets. Garrett was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the desk. Finally he spoke. My patrol leaves tomorrow at dawn. It's led by Lieutenant William Chadwick, a good officer but young and eager to prove himself. You'll ride with them, but understand this, you're an observer, not a negotiator. If Lieutenant Chadwick determines there's a threat, you will not interfere with military operations. Are we clear? Crystal clear, Major. Good. There's a bunk available in the civilian quarters. You'll stay here tonight and be ready to move out at first light. Garrett picked up a pen, signaling the conversation was over. And Brennan? I hope you're right about these Indians. Because if you're wrong, if this is some kind of trap, or if you've been duped, it'll be soldiers' blood on your hands. Thomas stood. Understood, sir. Thank you for hearing me out. That night, lying on a hard bunk in a drafty building, Thomas stared at the ceiling and questioned every choice that had led him to this moment. He was about to ride with soldiers toward a camp full of people who trusted him, trying to play mediator in a situation where one wrong word could lead to disaster. The weight of it pressed down on him like a physical force. He thought about Ayesha's face when she'd asked him to help, about the children playing in the snow at the camp, about Chief Maka's quiet dignity. He thought about the soldiers here at the fort, young men following orders in a conflict they'd inherited. Everyone was afraid. Everyone was trying to survive. And somehow, Thomas had ended up in the middle, trying to build a bridge across a divide that seemed designed to be uncrossable. Dawn came too quickly. Thomas joined the patrol as they assembled, 12 soldiers led by Lieutenant Chadwick, who turned out to be exactly what Major Garrett had described. Young, maybe 24, with sharp eyes and a bearing that suggested he was determined to make his mark. He regarded Thomas with obvious suspicion, but accepted the Major's orders to allow him to accompany the patrol. The ride north was tense. The soldiers were quiet, checking their weapons frequently and scanning the horizon for any sign of threat. Thomas tried to engage Chadwick in conversation, to explain the situation they were riding into, but the lieutenant's responses were clipped and formal. Mr. Brennan, I appreciate your concerns, Chadwick said at one point. But my orders are to assess potential threats. If this camp is peaceful, that assessment will reflect that. If it's not, we'll take appropriate action. And what constitutes appropriate action? Thomas asked. That depends on what we find. It was a non-answer, and Thomas knew it. He could see in the lieutenant's bearing, in the way the soldiers held their rifles, that they were expecting trouble. They'd been trained to see Indians as enemies, had probably lost friends, or heard stories of raids and massacres. They were scared, which made them dangerous. When they reached the ridge overlooking the valley where the Lakota camp lay, Thomas felt his stomach tighten. The camp looked peaceful from this distance. Smoke rising from lodges, horses grazing, no signs of fortifications or preparations for war. But he could also see that the Lakota had spotted them. Figures were moving between lodges with new purpose, and while Thomas couldn't see weapons from this distance, he knew they were there. The camp was preparing to defend itself if necessary. Hold here, Chadwick ordered his men. He pulled out field glasses and studied the camp below. I count approximately 20 lodges. Maybe 150 people, give or take. I see women and children, but also military-age males. No fortifications, but they're definitely aware of our presence. They're scared, Thomas said. They see soldiers, and they remember all the times peaceful camps have been attacked. Lieutenant, if we ride in there with guns drawn, they'll defend themselves. It'll be a bloodbath that nobody wants. Chadwick lowered the glasses and looked at Thomas. What do you suggest? Let me ride down first, alone. I'll talk to Chief Mucker, explain that you're here to verify they're peaceful, not to attack. Then you can come down, slowly, with weapons holstered, and conduct whatever assessment you need to make. One of the older soldiers, a sergeant with weather-beaten features, spoke up. Sir, sending a civilian down alone could be a death sentence. We don't know what kind of reception he'll get. I've been there before, Thomas said. They know me. They'll listen. Chadwick considered this, his jaw working as he thought through the options. Finally, he nodded. You have 10 minutes. If you're not back, or if we hear shooting, we're coming in. Thomas dismounted and began walking down the slope toward the camp on foot, leading his horse. Every step felt like it took an eternity. He could feel the soldiers watching from behind, could sense the Lakota watching from ahead. He was exposed, vulnerable, caught between two armed groups who had every reason not to trust each other. When he was about 50 yards from the nearest lodge, Chaska emerged, flanked by two warriors with rifles. Thomas raised his hands to show he was unarmed, except for his holstered pistol. Chaska, he called out. I need to speak with Chief Mucker. The soldiers on the ridge. I brought them here, but not to attack. Let me explain. Chaska's expression was unreadable, but he gestured for Thomas to follow. As they walked through the camp, Thomas was acutely aware of the fear in people's eyes, the way mothers pulled children close, the way warriors positioned themselves to protect their families. This was what terror looked like, not aggression, but people preparing to fight because they saw no other choice. Chief Mucker stood outside his lodge, his bearing regal despite the circumstances. Ayasha stood beside him, her face pale but determined. When Thomas approached, the chief spoke rapidly in Lakota. Chaska translated, He asks if you have betrayed us. If you led the soldiers here to attack? No, Thomas said firmly, looking directly at Mucker. I went to the fort to try to prevent exactly this. The soldiers were coming anyway. I convinced them to let me come first, to help facilitate peace. Lieutenant Chadwick wants to verify that this camp is peaceful, and then he'll leave. But everyone needs to stay calm. Mucker studied Thomas for a long moment, and Thomas felt the weight of that gaze, measuring his truthfulness, his intentions, his honor. Finally, the chief spoke. He says you have proven yourself a true friend by coming alone to warn us, Chaska translated. But he says soldiers' promises are like spring ice. They look solid, but often break when tested. What guarantee do we have that they won't attack once they're in the camp? None, Thomas admitted. Just my word that I'll stand between you and them, if it comes to that. And my belief is that Lieutenant Chadwick is an honorable man who'll follow his orders, which are to assess, not to attack without cause. Ayasha spoke up, her English improving from their last conversation. You risk much for us. Why, you hardly know our people. Thomas looked at her, at the fear and hope mingled in her young face, and found himself speaking a truth he hadn't fully acknowledged until that moment. Because I'm tired of living in a world where we treat each other like enemies by default. Because those children playing in your camp deserve the same chance at life as the soldiers' children back home. Because if I can't take a stand for what's right when it costs me something, then what kind of man am I? Chief Mucker spoke, his voice carrying authority. Chaska translated, The soldiers may come. We will welcome them with respect, show them we mean no harm, but tell their leader that we are not afraid to defend our families if threatened. We will choose peace, but we are capable of war. Thomas nodded. I'll tell him. He turned to head back up the ridge, but Ayasha caught his arm. Be careful, she said softly. Some whites do not like those who walk between worlds. You make enemies on both sides? I know, Thomas said. But maybe that's exactly where I need to be. The walk back up to the ridge felt longer than the walk down had been. When Thomas reached the waiting soldiers, he explained the situation to Lieutenant Chadwick. "The chief will allow you to enter the camp, but slowly, respectfully, with weapons holstered. He wants to demonstrate that they're peaceful, but he's also made it clear they'll defend themselves if attacked." Chadwick nodded slowly. "Understood." Men were going in. "Weapons holstered, but stay alert. Show respect, but don't let your guard down. Sergeant Morrison, you'll stay with half the men here on the ridge. If anything goes wrong, you know what to do." The ride down into the valley was one of the most tense experiences of Thomas's life. The soldiers were wound tight as springs, hands hovering near weapons. The Lakota watched their approach with carefully controlled expressions, neither welcoming nor hostile. Thomas rode beside Chadwick, trying to project calm confidence he didn't entirely feel. Chief Maka met them in the center of the camp, with Chaska translating. What followed was a careful dance of diplomacy, Chadwick asking questions about the camp's size, their intentions, their movements. Maka answering honestly but with dignity, never apologizing for his people's existence, but making it clear they sought no conflict. Thomas facilitated when needed, helping clarify misunderstandings before they could escalate. At one point, a young warrior, Tokala, whom Thomas recognized from his time in camp, made an aggressive gesture and spoke sharply to one of the soldiers who'd wandered too close to a lodge. Instantly, weapons were drawn on both sides. Thomas found himself physically stepping between the two groups, his hands raised. "Wait!" he shouted. "Everyone stop. Tokala, he didn't mean disrespect. He doesn't know your customs. Lieutenant, lower your weapons. This can be resolved without violence. For a heartbeat, everything hung in the balance." Then Chief Maka spoke a single command, and Tokala stepped back, though his eyes burned with anger. Chadwick, after a tense pause, ordered his men to holster their weapons. "That could have gone very differently," Chadwick said quietly to Thomas. "You may have just saved lives on both sides." The assessment continued for another hour. The soldiers examined the camp, noting the presence of families, the absence of war preparations, the simple evidence of people trying to survive winter. Chadwick interviewed several of the Lakota through Thomas and Chaska's translation, getting consistent stories about their peaceful intentions. Finally, as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Chadwick made his decision. "We've seen enough. This camp appears to pose no immediate threat. I'll report back to Major Garrett that the situation is stable." He turned to Chief Maka, speaking formally. "Your people are free to remain here for the winter, as is your right under treaty. But any raids or attacks originating from this camp will bring consequences. Are we understood?" After translation, Maka responded with equal formality. "We understand. We ask only to be left in peace to survive the winter. When spring comes, we will move on, as we always have." As the soldiers prepared to leave, Ayasha approached Thomas one more time. "You kept your word," she said. "You stood between warriors and soldiers. You risked yourself for people, not your own." "We're not as different as we pretend to be," Thomas said. "Fear just makes us forget that." That night, camped with the soldiers on their return journey to the fort, Thomas sat by the fire and felt the full weight of exhaustion settle over him. His body ached, his mind was spinning, and he knew that the confrontation at the camp had been just one step in a much longer, more complicated journey. Lieutenant Chadwick sat down beside him. "You did good work today, Brennan. I'm not sure I would have listened if you hadn't been there to explain things." "You listened because you're a good officer," Thomas said. "You followed your orders to assess the threat, not to create one." "Maybe," Chadwick said. "But I'll tell you something, this won't be the end of it. There are people, both white and Indian, who don't want peace, who profit from conflict or can't imagine any other way. What you did today bought time, nothing more." "Then I'll take the time," Thomas said. "Because time is all any of us really have." The ride back to his ranch the next day gave Thomas hours to process what had happened. He'd stood between two armed groups and prevented bloodshed through nothing more than words and willingness to put himself at risk. He'd proven that the bond of cola meant something real, that friendship could transcend the divisions that seemed so absolute in this territory. But he'd also seen how fragile that peace was, how easily it could have shattered. One wrong word, one aggressive gesture, one soldier or warrior who couldn't control their fear or anger, and it all would have ended in gunfire and death. When he finally reached his cabin, Thomas dismounted and stood for a moment, looking at the place he'd called home for 3 years. It looked different now somehow, smaller, more isolated. He'd spent so long trying to keep the world at arm's length, trying to live a simple life, free from complications and conflicts. But in saving Ayasha's life, he'd been pulled back into the world whether he wanted to be or not. And the surprising thing, he realized as he unsaddled his horse and went inside to build up the fire, was that he didn't regret it. For the first time since the war, Thomas Brennan felt like he was part of something larger than his own survival. He had friends who depended on him, responsibilities that mattered, a purpose beyond just making it through another winter. The loneliness that had defined his existence for so long had begun to crack, replaced by connections that were complicated and dangerous, but undeniably real. He thought about Ayasha's smile when he'd agreed to help, about Chief Marka's nod of respect, about the way the children in camp had waved at him as the soldiers left. He'd crossed a line he could never uncross, had committed himself to a path that would only grow more difficult. But as Thomas settled into his chair by the fire that evening, warming his hands and feeling the familiar ache in his muscles from days of hard riding, he knew he'd made the right choice. The turning point had come and passed, and Thomas Brennan had discovered something he'd thought he'd lost in the war, the ability to care about something beyond his own survival, to fight for something worth fighting for, not because orders demanded it, but because his conscience required it. Whatever came next, he'd face it the same way he'd faced everything else, with his eyes open, his honor intact, and a willingness to stand in the gap between two worlds, holding the line for peace as long as it could be held. Spring came slowly to the Dakota Territory that year, as if winter was reluctant to release its grip. But come it did, one thawing day at a time, until the snow began to retreat from the valleys and the frozen creeks started to flow again. Thomas watched the transformation from his porch, coffee cup in hand, marveling at how much had changed in the 4 months since he'd pulled a dying girl from a snowdrift. The isolation he'd once valued had become something different. Not loneliness exactly, but a deliberate solitude that he now broke regularly with visits to the Lakota camp. He'd made the journey 7 times since that tense day with the soldiers, each visit deepening his understanding of a culture he'd once known nothing about. He'd learned more Lakota words, enough to hold basic conversations without always needing Chaska to translate. He'd participated in ceremonies he didn't fully understand, but respected nonetheless. And he'd formed friendships that transcended the boundaries of race and culture that were supposed to be absolute. Chief Marka had become something like a mentor to him, though neither man would have used that word. They'd spent long evenings by the fire in the chief's lodge, with Thomas asking questions about Lakota history and philosophy, and Marka inquiring about the white world with its railroads and telegraphs and endless push westward. These conversations had no solutions to offer, no way to bridge the fundamental conflict between two peoples competing for the same land. But they created understanding, and understanding was worth something even when it couldn't prevent the inevitable. Ayasha had surprised Thomas most of all. What had started as a simple debt of gratitude had evolved into a genuine friendship. She was fierce and intelligent, with a curiosity about the world that reminded Thomas of himself at that age. She'd been teaching him about plants that could be used for medicine, about reading the weather in ways his farmer's almanac never captured, about the stories her people told to explain the mysteries of existence. In return, Thomas had taught her more English, had explained how the white settlements worked, had tried to answer her endless questions about why his people did the things they did. On this particular morning in early April, Thomas was preparing for what he knew would be his last visit to the winter camp. The Lakota would be breaking camp soon, moving to their summer grounds as the seasons demanded. It was the natural rhythm of their life, this migration that followed the buffalo and the weather, but Thomas found himself mourning the end of this chapter. The camp in the valley had become a second home of sorts, a place where he could be fully himself without the weight of others' expectations. He was loading supplies into his saddlebags, gifts he'd carefully selected over the past week, including wool blankets, steel needles, and a bag of sugar that had cost him dearly at the trading post in a town 20 miles from Stillwater, when he heard the sound of approaching horses. Thomas turned to see 3 riders cresting the hill that led to his ranch, and his hand instinctively moved toward his rifle before he recognized them. Chief Maka rode in the center, flanked by Chaska and another warrior Thomas knew as Ohanzi. They moved with the easy confidence of men comfortable in their saddles, and as they drew closer, Thomas could see that Maka carried something wrapped in leather across his lap. Thomas set down his saddlebags and walked out to meet them, raising his hand in greeting. "Chief Maka, Chaska Ohanzi, this is unexpected. Is something wrong?" Chaska translated Thomas's question, and Maka responded with a slight smile. "Nothing wrong," Chaska said. "But the chief says he could not let the season change without honoring his debt to you properly. We break camp in 3 days. Before we go, there is something he wishes to give you." The 3 Lakota dismounted, and Maka approached Thomas, carrying the leather-wrapped bundle. He spoke at length, his voice formal but warm, and Chaska translated carefully. "The chief says that you have proven yourself a true friend to his people. You did not just save his daughter's life. You stood between warriors and soldiers when peace hung by a thread. You visited our camp when others of your kind would not. You treated us with respect, even when it cost you the respect of your own people. These actions cannot go unmarked." Maka unwrapped the leather to reveal what lay inside, a rifle, but unlike any Thomas had seen. The stock was intricately carved with designs that told a story. He could make out buffalo, eagles, warriors on horseback, and in the center, a figure that might have been Thomas himself, standing between 2 groups. The metalwork had been polished until it shone, and the whole weapon was clearly the product of exceptional craftsmanship. "This rifle belonged to the chief's father," Chaska continued translating. "It has been carried in 3 great hunts and 2 battles. It has never failed. The chief says it should belong to a warrior of honor, and he can think of no one more deserving than you." Thomas felt his throat tighten. He understood the significance of such a gift. This wasn't just a weapon, it was a family heirloom, a piece of history being passed to him. "Chief Maka, this is too much. I can't accept something so valuable to your family." Maka spoke again, and this time there was no mistaking the emotion in his voice, even before Chaska translated. "He says you already are family. The bond of Kola has been proven in action, not just words. To refuse this gift would be to refuse the friendship itself. He asks that you accept it with the spirit in which it is given." Thomas took the rifle, feeling its weight, running his fingers over the intricate carvings. "Then I accept with gratitude and humility. I'll carry it with honor and remember what it represents." Maka smiled broadly and gripped Thomas's shoulder in a gesture that needed no translation. Then he turned to his horse and retrieved something else, a smaller bundle wrapped in soft deer skin. He handed it to Thomas with a few words, "From Ayasha," Chaska translated. "She made this herself and asked her father to deliver it, since she is helping prepare for the move and could not come." Thomas unwrapped the deerskin to find a shirt made of soft buckskin, decorated with intricate beadwork in shades of blue and white. The design incorporated symbols he'd learned to recognize: the morning star for guidance, the turtle for long life and along the shoulders, the symbol that meant friend or ally. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each bead perfectly placed, the stitching invisible. "She's been working on this all winter," Chaska added with a slight smile. "Every evening after her other work was done. She wanted you to have something that would remind you of the friendship between your peoples. Even when distance separates you, Thomas held the shirt carefully, overwhelmed by the thought of Ayasha spending countless hours creating this gift. Please tell her. Tell her I'll treasure this, and tell her I'll miss our conversations. You can tell her yourself, Chaska said. The chief invites you to join us for a final feast tomorrow night. The whole camp wants to say farewell properly. Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. These people, who had every reason to hate and fear whites, had welcomed him with open hearts. They'd shared their food, their stories, their wisdom. They'd made him feel like he belonged in a way Stillwater never had. After the Lakota riders departed, Thomas went inside and carefully hung the beaded shirt where he could see it. Then he spent the rest of the day preparing for the farewell feast, selecting gifts for the families he'd grown closest to, thinking about what he wanted to say to people who'd changed his understanding of the world. The next evening, Thomas rode into the Lakota camp for the last time that season. The atmosphere was different than his previous visits. There was an undercurrent of both celebration and melancholy, the bittersweet feeling that comes with necessary endings. Many of the lodges had already been partially dismantled, their contents packed for travel, but the central area where gatherings were held remained intact. The feast was magnificent. The hunters had brought down an elk the previous day, and the meat had been roasted to perfection. There were also fish from the creek, wild onions and other plants gathered by the women, dried berries mixed with fat, and bread made from traded flour. The entire camp gathered around the fire as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Thomas sat in a place of honor near Chief Maka, wearing the beaded shirt Ayasha had made. When she'd first seen him in it, her face had lit up with a smile that made all the months of work worthwhile. Now she sat across the fire, and Thomas kept catching her eye, both of them smiling at the unspoken understanding between them. As the meal concluded, Chief Maka stood to speak. The camp grew quiet, everyone giving him their full attention. He spoke for several minutes, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. Thomas couldn't understand all the words, but he caught enough. His own name, references to the rescue, mentions of courage and honor. When Maka finished, Chaska provided a fuller translation. The chief says that when the cold season began, he feared for his daughter's life and found her returned to him by a stranger. He says that stranger became friends, and that friend became brothers. He says that Thomas Brennan has shown his people that not all whites are enemies, that there are still those who see with clear eyes and open hearts. He says that as long as he lives, Thomas will be welcome in any camp where Maka's people gather, and that any who harm Thomas will answer to him personally. A murmur of agreement ran through the gathered crowd. Several warriors stood and spoke briefly, each offering their own words of respect and friendship. Thomas recognized Tokala among them, the young warrior who'd been so suspicious at first. Even he acknowledged that Thomas had proven himself worthy of trust. Then it was Thomas's turn to speak. He stood, very aware that every eye was on him, and took a moment to gather his thoughts. When he spoke, Chaska translated sentence by sentence, making sure his words reached everyone. 4 months ago, I thought I understood the world. I thought I knew the difference between right and wrong, between friend and enemy. Then a blizzard came, and I heard a cry in the darkness, and everything I thought I knew began to change. He paused, looking around at the faces illuminated by firelight. You welcomed a stranger into your homes. You shared your food, your stories, your wisdom. You trusted me when trust was dangerous. You showed me that the divisions we create between people are often lies we tell ourselves to justify our fears. He turned to Ayasha. Your daughter saved my life as much as I saved hers. She gave me back something I'd lost, the ability to connect with others, to be part of something larger than my own survival. For that, I will always be grateful. Looking back at Chief Maka, Thomas continued, I don't know what the future holds for your people or mine. I know the challenges are great and the conflicts are real, but I also know that friendship like this, built on respect and proven through action, is worth fighting for. When you move to your summer grounds and I return to my ranch, the distance between us won't diminish what we've built here." As Chaska finished translating, Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. "I brought gifts, but they seem inadequate now. So instead, I want to offer something else, a promise. If your people ever need help, if there's something I can do to bridge the gap between our worlds, you need only send a word. The bond of Kola works both ways, and I intend to honor it for as long as I live." Chief Maka stood and embraced Thomas, and the gesture sparked a wave of warmth throughout the gathering. People approached to say their own farewells, warriors clasping his arm, women thanking him for his friendship, children shyly offering small gifts they'd made. It was overwhelming and humbling and beautiful all at once. Later, as the feast wound down and people began to drift back to their lodges, Iyasha found Thomas standing at the edge of the camp looking up at the stars. She approached quietly, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the cooling night air. "You will forget us," she said softly in English. "When we are gone and summer comes, you will return to your life and we will become a memory." Thomas shook his head. "No, what happened here changed me. You changed me. I won't forget, Ayasha. I couldn't if I tried." She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What will you do now? Your own people have cast you out. You walk between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Is that not lonely?" "Sometimes," Thomas admitted. "But it's also free. I don't have to be what either world expects me to be. I can just be myself, trying to do what's right." Ayasha smiled. "You are strange, Thomas Brennan." "Strange in a good way?" She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, pressing it into his hand. "For you." "So you remember?" Thomas looked down to find a small carved figure, a turtle, the symbol for long life, made from bone and polished smooth. It was simple but beautiful, clearly made with care. "The turtle carries his home on his back," Ayasha explained. "He's never lost because he's always home. I think you are like this now. Your home is not a place, it is here." She touched his chest over his heart. "In the choices you make, the friendships you keep, the honor you carry. That is something no one can take from you." Thomas closed his fingers around the small carving, feeling its smooth surface. "Thank you for everything. For trusting me, for teaching me, for—" He struggled to find the right words. "For helping me find my way back to being human again. I didn't realize how lost I was until I found myself here." "You were not lost," Ayasha said. "You were waiting. Sometimes we must wait in darkness before we can see the light." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead in their eternal patterns. Around them, the camp settled into sleep, the fires banking down to coals, the sounds of conversation fading into the night. This moment, Thomas knew, would stay with him forever, the feeling of belonging, of being seen and accepted, of mattering to people who had no obligation to care about him. The next morning came too quickly. Thomas was up before dawn, preparing for his departure before the camp began its own. He wanted to leave quietly, without prolonged farewells that would make the parting harder than it already was. But when he emerged from the guest lodge, he found Chief Maka already awake, sitting by a small fire. The chief gestured for Thomas to join him, and they sat together as the sky slowly lightened. Maka spoke in Lakota, his words measured and deliberate. Though Thomas's understanding of the language was still limited, he caught the essence: gratitude, respect, hope for the future, and an acknowledgement that their paths might not cross again for a long time, if ever. When Maka finished, Thomas responded in his halting Lakota, doing his best to express similar sentiments. The chief smiled at his efforts, then replied in the few English words he'd learned, "Good man, good friend. Go with the spirit's blessing." They clasped arms in the warrior's grip, holding the connection for a long moment before releasing. Then Thomas mounted his horse, taking one last look around the camp that had become so familiar. A few early risers had emerged from their lodges to see him off, raising their hands in farewell. Ayasha stood near her father's lodge, and when their eyes met, she pressed her hand over her heart, a gesture that needed no words. Thomas returned the gesture, then turned his horse toward home. The ride back to his ranch felt different than any journey he'd made before. The landscape was the same, rolling hills, scattered trees, the endless sky, but Thomas saw it through changed eyes. This land was big enough for everyone, he thought. If only people could see past their fears and prejudices, if only they could recognize the humanity in those who seemed different. But he knew it wasn't that simple. The conflicts were real, the grievances on both sides legitimate. The Lakota were fighting for survival against an invasion that seemed unstoppable. The settlers were trying to build new lives in a harsh land, haunted by legitimate fears of violence. Both sides had lost people they loved. Both sides had reasons for their anger and mistrust. Thomas couldn't solve these problems. He was just one man, caught between two worlds, doing his best to maintain his integrity in a situation that seemed designed to make integrity impossible. But maybe that was enough. Maybe every person who chose understanding over hatred, who chose to see individuals rather than stereotypes, created a small crack in the walls that divided people. And maybe, over time, enough cracks could bring those walls down. When Thomas reached his ranch, he sat on his porch and looked out at the land he'd claimed 3 years ago. It looked different now, less like a refuge from the world, and more like a small part of a much larger story. The cabin, the barn, the cattle grazing in the distance, these were still his responsibilities, still his life. But they no longer defined the totality of who he was. He went inside and placed the carved turtle on a shelf where he could see it every day. Next to it, he set a small eagle feather that Chaska had given him at the feast. These objects were more than gifts. They were reminders of what was possible when people chose connection over division. Over the following weeks, Thomas settled back into his routines with a contentment he hadn't felt in years. He tended his cattle, repaired winter damage to his buildings, planted a garden that would feed him through the next winter. But he also made changes. He rode to the trading post in the distant town regularly, becoming a known face despite his reputation as that man who lived with the Sioux. He didn't hide his friendship with the Lakota or apologize for the choices he'd made. Some people treated him with suspicion or outright hostility, but others, more than he'd expected, approached him with questions. What were the Lakota really like? Did they really want war, or were they just defending their lands? Was it possible to live peacefully alongside them? Thomas answered honestly, neither romanticizing the Lakota nor demonizing the settlers. He spoke of Mahka's wisdom and Tokala's anger, of families trying to survive and warriors trying to protect what was theirs. He talked about the feast and the rifle and the beaded shirt, about ordinary moments of kindness that transcended the supposed divide between civilizations, and slowly, carefully, he began to plant seeds of understanding in soil that had seemed too hard and bitter to grow anything but hatred. One evening in late spring, as Thomas sat on his porch watching the sunset, he reflected on the man he'd been when winter began and the man he'd become. He'd arrived in Dakota Territory 3 years ago, seeking escape from painful memories and the judgments of others. He'd built a life of deliberate isolation, convincing himself that solitude was the same as peace. But saving Ayasha had shattered that illusion. It had forced him back into the world, back into connection and conflict and all the messy complications of caring about others. And in doing so, it had saved him just as surely as he'd saved her. Thomas pulled out the small turtle carving and turned it over in his fingers, remembering Ayasha's words about carrying your home within yourself. She'd been right. His home wasn't this ranch or any physical place. It was in the choices he made every day, the principles he refused to compromise, the connections he'd built with people who'd started as strangers and become family. The future remained uncertain. The conflicts between settlers and native peoples would continue, probably worsen. Thomas knew his friendship with the Lakota wouldn't prevent the tragedies that seemed inevitable. But it mattered anyway. Every act of kindness mattered. Every choice to see humanity in the other mattered. Every bridge built between divided worlds mattered, even if that bridge could only carry one person at a time. As darkness fell and the stars began to appear, Thomas went inside to prepare his evening meal. The cabin felt warmer than it had before winter, more like a home and less like a hiding place. The beaded shirt hung on the wall where he could see it, a reminder of friendship that had transcended every boundary society tried to impose. The rifle stood in the corner, a symbol of trust that had been earned through action rather than words. And on the shelf, the small turtle reminded him daily that he was never truly alone, that he carried his home within himself, that the connections he'd forged would endure regardless of distance or time. Thomas Brennan had started the winter as a man running from his past, afraid of connection, convinced that isolation was safety. He ended it as someone who'd learned that true safety came from standing for something larger than himself, that the greatest danger was not in reaching out to others, but in refusing to try. The bond of Kola had proven to be more than words in a language he was still learning. It was a living thing, strengthened by each choice to honor it, by each moment when fear was overcome by trust, by each small act that recognized the humanity in those society labeled as enemies. Spring turned to summer, and life went on. Thomas worked his ranch and made his careful forays into a world that still didn't quite know what to make of him. He heard occasional news of the Lakota's movements, of their summer hunt, of continuing tensions between tribes and settlers and soldiers. He worried about Ayasha and Maka and Chaska and all the others who'd welcomed him into their lives. But he also knew that worry was proof of connection, and connection was what gave life meaning. He'd learned that you couldn't protect yourself from pain by refusing to care. You could only make yourself smaller, more isolated, more alone. Thomas had chosen a different path. He'd chosen to care, to connect, to stand in the gap between worlds and hold the line for understanding even when it cost him. And in making that choice, he discovered something he'd lost somewhere in the blood and mud of battlefields years ago. He discovered hope. Not the naive hope that everything would work out perfectly, but the stubborn hope that insisted individual choices mattered, that kindness was never wasted, that bridges between people could be built even in the hardest of times. As Thomas stood on his porch one evening, watching the sun set over the vast Dakota territory, he thought about the journey that had brought him here, from a soldier trying to survive a war to a settler trying to escape his past, to a man who'd finally found his place, not by choosing a side, but by choosing to be fully human in a world that too often demanded people be less than that. The turtle in his pocket, the beaded shirt in his cabin, the rifle that had belonged to a chief's father, these were more than objects. They were proof that he'd lived, truly lived, and that his life had touched others in ways that mattered. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Thomas Brennan smiled. The loneliness that had driven him west was gone, replaced by something far more precious, the knowledge that he was part of a larger story, connected to people who'd changed him as much as he'd changed them, carrying within himself a home that no one could take away. Winter had tested him and transformed him. Spring had brought new beginnings, and whatever summer and fall would bring, Thomas knew he'd face it as himself, no longer hiding, no longer running, but standing firm in the truth that every life mattered, that friendship was worth fighting for, and that the simple act of showing up and caring was sometimes the bravest thing a person could do. The world would keep turning. Conflicts would continue. History would unfold in ways no individual could control. But Thomas Brennan had learned that you didn't have to control history to make a difference. You just had to show up when it mattered, stand for what was right when it was difficult, and trust that small acts of courage and kindness rippled outward in ways you couldn't always see. He'd started the winter alone. He ended it connected, to the land, to his past, to people who'd taught him what it meant to truly be alive. And that connection, that bond of Kola that had been forged in crisis and proven through trial, would sustain him through whatever came next. Because in the end, that was what mattered most. Not the battles won or lost, not the judgments of others, not even the uncertain future of this contested land. What mattered was that he'd chosen humanity over hatred, connection over isolation, hope over despair, and in making that choice, Thomas Brennan had finally come home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.